Some of the most challenging questions that you will get at medicine interviews are those around the pieces of legislature, so the laws that govern some of the practices that we can do. They're often the most complicated questions, so having a really good understanding of medical law is really important if you want to be in that top 10%, as I always say, to stand out at interview and convert that opportunity into an offer. So today we're going to look in depth at both of those pieces of law and how you're going to answer questions to really stand out when it comes to your big day. The first thing we're going to look at is a term known as capacity. Now, the definition of capacity is the ability of a patient to give consent. This is usually assessed by the patient's understanding of what they are about to undertake. So really what capacity is doing is looking at a patient's ability to give permission to have treatment. So here we use the word consent. So let's define consent quickly so that we're on the same page as to what that means. So consent is where a patient gives their permission for something to happen. In a medical context, this is usually an examination, an investigation, or a treatment. And often in medicine, we refer to a term called informed consent, which is beyond just consent, because the patient needs to be aware of the risks, the benefits, and the likely outcome of the treatment before they can give their consent. So when we go back to capacity that we were talking about earlier, for a patient to give their consent, they must have the capacity, which means the mental abilities essentially, to give their permission for a treatment, examination, procedure to go ahead. So the important bit of legislation that you need to remember regarding capacity is the Mental Capacity Act of 2005. Now it stipulates 4 circumstances under which a patient is able to give capacity. Those are, number 1, that they can understand the information given. Then that they can retain that information. Number 3 is that they can weigh up the risks and benefits of what you've just explained. And then finally, number 4 is that they can communicate that decision to you. So most of the time that is pretty straightforward. You have a patient with capacity and they can just understand all of that, weigh up the risks and benefits, and then communicate that decision back to you and retain everything that you've told them. But there are some times when capacity is impaired. That can be temporarily, and you can have situations like this, or it can be permanently impaired in situations like this. So there are times where we have to assess those 4 criteria to see whether they actually have capacity. Now, the thing to remember is that making a seemingly unwise decision, but perfectly rationally, is not the same as not having capacity. So if a patient decides, for example, not to have treatment, and that might seem foolish to you, if they meet those 4 criteria and have capacity, they are perfectly within their rights to do so. Now, if a patient lacks capacity and can't make decisions for themselves, there are some pieces of legislature that are there to help you uphold your duty of care to the patient. The first is that of best interests. So if it's deemed that the treatment is going to help the patient, and if they were sound of mind, you could reasonably assume that they would want that treatment, then you can act under the patient's best interests. The second thing is that they can have a medical proxy. So that means that they have pre-allocated, or maybe the law will allocate a person who can make decisions on their behalf. And then finally, you have something called an advance directive. Now this is sometimes done, but this is when a person has a legal document to say, in the circumstance or in the event that I am in X, Y, and Z condition, that I would like A, B, C to happen. Now this can get quite complicated, and if you really want to know the nitty-gritty and ins and outs of it to, like I say, stand out at interview, there's a book that I recommend in the description below where you can really just get to grips with this and have a really good handle on it just by reading that reasonably short book. One thing that people do get a bit confused about is best interests. So this is where we take a collective decision. So you look at the patient's notes, for example, if they don't have capacity, understand what their medical history is like, what the current disease or issue that they have is it likely to get better, is it likely to get worse, what's worked in the past, what have they asked for in the past. Maybe you'd look at things like cultural preferences, anything like that. And then you're working together, usually with family, relatives, or maybe some friends who know the patient really well. Because remember, you don't know this patient. You don't know what you think they would want. But working together and getting consensus on what we feel is the best way to go forward in this given circumstance. That would be how we act under the best interest principle. The patient is an individual, so it's different for each person. So it's really important to collect as much information as we can about them to make a sound judgment on, for that individual, what is the thing that we should do in their best interest. So just to round off capacity, there are 4 key principles that you must understand. The first is that every patient is deemed to have capacity unless proven otherwise. The second is that when you explain the treatment, the risks and benefits, all of that stuff to a patient, if they don't understand initially, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have capacity. They may just not have resonated with your way of communicating that. So you do have to try every way of explaining it that you can before you deem that that patient has not understood your explanation. Number 3, remember that a seemingly poor decision does not necessarily mean the patient doesn't have capacity. If it's unwise or you don't agree with it, but they have very sound logic and they can explain fully and fluently why they don't want to have that treatment, that does not mean that they don't have capacity. Then number 4, remember that capacity is situation specific. So for example, we'll talk about child capacity and child consent issues later, but if a child wants to consent, they can consent to something like having their blood pressure taken because they understand it and they don't need a high level of mental acuity to understand the realities of that. However, if you were to consent a 6-year-old on surgery, that's a very different story because it's a lot more involved. They may not understand exactly the implications of that, and the situation is very different. So therefore, like I say, capacity is situation specific. So the same person might deem to not have capacity for a certain situation, then in another situation it's perfectly fine to have capacity for. So let's look at consent. Now, just a reminder of the definition of consent. Consent is where a patient gives their permission for something to happen. In a medical context, this is usually an examination, an investigation, or a treatment. And as I said, in medicine, we're more concerned about a term called informed consent. Now, for informed consent to happen, the 5 following criteria must be met. Firstly, the patient must be deemed to have capacity. Then, they must be explained the risks, the benefits, and the likely outcome of the procedure. The information must be presented in a way to them that they understand. So like I say, if they don't understand the first explanation, you might just have to reframe your communication for how you get that message across to them. Number 4 is that the patient must be given thinking time and the opportunity to ask questions. And then finally, number 5 is that you must respect the patient's autonomy of their decision. Autonomy means the right to choose and the right to have say over their care. And actually, if you want to check out this video here, we talk about the 4 key pillars of medical ethics, which we go into all of those in a lot more detail. So that will really help you understand how to use that framework to approach any ethical scenarios in medicine. Ultimately, the 5th point is that you have to respect the patient's decision and don't try and coerce them into treatment or an examination or whatever the proposed thing is. So the times when these pieces of law get complicated are around some of the things that can happen. So one of them is withholding consent. So that means when a patient says, well, you know what, I actually don't want that treatment. So one of the things to remember is that as long as the patient has capacity, then that is absolutely within their right to do that. Again, also remember that even if it seems like a foolish decision, that is perfectly fine as long as they have capacity. What I would recommend is if you get a situation like this, or if you get asked a question on this subject, is it's always good to reiterate the risks and what the reality is if they don't have the treatment or whatever the thing that is proposed. What is likely to happen, maybe make sure that they have fully understood it and check before you allow that. But then, of course, like I say, if they have capacity and they want to withhold consent, they are perfectly within their rights to do so. So what about children? And it does get a little bit complicated with children because there are laws for if a patient wants to give consent, but also different laws for if they want to withhold consent. So I'll talk about the first one, which is a really important one for a patient giving consent, so a child who wants to give consent. Now, there is something called Gillick Competence. Now that means that a child, no matter what their age is, the children are able to consent to treatment if it's in their best interest and they have the capacity to do so. For that to happen, they must understand the nature of the treatment, the risks and benefits, and the alternative treatments. If they meet those criteria, then the patients are deemed to be Gillick competent. Now remember, this can be situation specific. A 6-year-old might very well understand that having their blood pressure taken, what it implies, roughly what it's for, and they can give consent to that. But having them have their appendix out is a different story that they probably don't have the capacity to understand. So, like I say, if we deem the patient to be Gillick competent and they have met all those criteria and they want to give permission for a treatment to go ahead, that is deemed in their best interest. Once they do that, they cannot be overruled. But on the flip side of things, when it comes to refusing treatment, it's really important to remember that children cannot refuse treatment that is deemed in their best interest, even if they are deemed Gillick competent. It's really important to understand these distinctions when it comes to your medicine interviews because you will be asked about the specifics of them. The other bit that you'll get asked a lot about is the Fraser Guidelines. Now the Fraser Guidelines came about by a famous case of a young girl trying to get the oral contraceptive pill, and then these guidelines were based around them. So the Fraser Guidelines are a set of instructions given to practitioners when advising under 16s in relation to sexual health and contraception matters without parental consent. And what it really does is give 5 circumstances under which doctors can provide sexual health or contraception advice to under 16s. So to do that, we must ensure that they meet the 5 Fraser Guidelines. The first is that the patient has to have the maturity to understand the advice and implications. Number 2 is that the doctor is not able to convince them to involve their parents in the decision. Number 3 is if you deem in matters related to contraception that the patient is about to continue to have sexual intercourse regardless of what you do. Number 4 is that if they went ahead without your intervention, their health, mental or physical, would suffer without your help. And number 5 is that it's within the child's best interest to give that advice without parental consent. So really important to be aware of those circumstances and the time that you can kind of break the rules, so to speak. So those 2 pieces of legislature will come up all the time, so make sure that you know a lot about them. Get that book that I was talking about. If you want to go into a bit more depth about that, ethics, confidentiality, all of the stuff that comes up very often, check out this resource here, which will give you everything to a level that you really need to know to kind of be in that top 10%, and it's just going to put you in a good place to do well at interview. Otherwise, if you'd like some one-on-one help with your interview, check out this video here where we can show you exactly what we can do to help you smash that interview and convert that opportunity into an offer. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.